Perfect. So, hello everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Barcode Podcast, entirely dedicated to the web development world. This is a kind of special episode because we here have a very special guest with us. He is Carson Gross, nonetheless the creator of the JavaScript library HTMX. Hi Carson, thank you so much for accepting my invitation and for being here with us. I appreciate it. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Well, thank you very much for having me on. I love, I want to get HTMX out there, so it's really exciting to talk to someone who's really plugged in the Italian web development scene. And I love Italy, and like I told you before the podcast, I worked with an Italian for a long time. I actually flew over to Italy for his wedding, and so I really like Italy a whole bunch.
Glad to hear that. Okay, perfect. Nice. So the goal of this episode is mainly to clarify what HTMX really is, because
Sure.
I feel like, especially in Italy, but also worldwide, I've noticed that developers often have some confused ideas about HTMX. I think that some think it's a new programming language, others believe it's an MDM specification, and others even associate it with something related to JSX, for example.
Right.
And
Sure.
that's why, together with Carson, we'll dive deep into what HTMX is and the reasons behind its creation. So, Carson, as I mentioned to you on LinkedIn, I'm a big fan of HTMX. Of course, I know what HTMX is. I've been using it extensively in my projects because I'm a software developer too. I'm the head of a development group. And I appreciate HTMX for two main reasons. The first one is I love vanilla JavaScript. I'm a lover of vanilla JavaScript. And despite knowing and using all the major JavaScript frameworks like, React, Angular, Svelte, Vue, Solid, and the list goes on, I often find them a little bit too complex compared to what can be achieved through alternative approaches. And as I told you, a few years ago, I even thought of creating something similar to HTMX because I really love the idea that is the core of HTMX. But of course, my vision was light years behind the final result that you achieved with HTMX. So, congratulations once again for your work. And the fact is, I see a lot of developers like myself using HTMX because it allows us to simplify the production of modern, of course, web applications through what we can call an old school approach based on kind of the classic asynchronous interaction between client and server. All of this while staying within HTML. So this is my personal consideration. We could say it's a bit like how Tailwind lets you use CSS without leaving HTML. And the fact is, I often hear developers saying React or Angular is a kind of an overkill for my small to medium sized application. So solutions like HTMX or Alpine, which I love too, are gaining quite a bit of traction, even in the modern web development world. So I've prepared a list of topics to discuss with you, Carson, which I'll now show on my screen.
Okay.
I'm sharing my screen. Okay,
You got it.
perfect. So here we are. So we are almost ready to get started, and
Yeah.
I'm going to hand it over to Carson. So let's begin with the first point. So first thing first. So who is Carson Gross from a development perspective?
Yeah, so from a software development perspective, I started programming when I was really young. I'm old, as the gray in my beard indicates. I'm almost 50 years old. And so I started programming in Apple II Basic
Yeah.
just a long, long time ago, and then ended up programming in something called HyperCard using HyperTalk, which was the scripting language. This was all sort of Apple-based stuff. And then I went to college as a developer or as a software. I wanted computer science, but I actually dropped out of computer science in college because I just wasn't able to keep up with the topics. Ended up becoming a professional developer anyways, despite that fact, and then went and got a master's in computer science because I sort of felt like I failed in my undergrad, and became just sort of did a traditional software developer role. I was in the Bay Area for a long time. And then I'd been doing web development sort of since the start, since sort of CGI scripts were the way to do things. I wasn't very good. I didn't have a good theoretical understanding of the web, but I was just more of a hacker and made it work. But did web development for a real long time and eventually sort of hit on this idea that HTMX is built around with a library that was sort of the predecessor to HTMX called Intercooler.js. And so Intercooler.js was my first open source project. I open sourced that back in 2013, and it got a little bit of traction, but not a ton. In what 2000, I think in 2020, I rewrote Intercooler.js was based on jQuery, and in 2020, when the COVID lockdowns hit, I was in California at the time, and I decided to say, okay, the COVID lockdown is going to drive me crazy. So I just locked myself in a room and and rewrote Intercooler.js, but without the jQuery dependency. And so at about that time, I also moved my family out to Montana and started teaching at Montana State. So I teach computer science at Montana State. So I do a lot of different types of programming work, work for my classes anyways. I work in C and assembly and so forth. And then I still do a lot of web development. I've got HTMX obviously, and I've got a scripting language called HyperScript, which is based on HyperCard's HyperTalk scripting language. So I think generally, as far as like my vision of the web goes, I like the simplicity of the web. I really have come to appreciate what I would call the hypermedia model of the web, and I like that. I like that HTML focus, that hypertext, hypermedia focus. So both that's reflected in both HTMX and HyperScript. Yeah, I think my philosophy, like I wrote a silly web page called grugbrain.dev, but in general, my philosophy is very much keep it simple. That doesn't mean I'm not willing to write complicated code. If you go and look at HyperScript, for example, it's pretty complicated, but I like keeping it as simple as possible for the goal you're trying to achieve. I don't know. I like going with the grain of things. So if something does 80% of what I want, maybe I'll work to make it do 90% or 95% of what I want. So that's one philosophical approach I take. I think you can see that in HTMX. It takes what HTML already does and then sort of like makes it do a little bit more of that. So,
Yeah, I saw a video when you described the HTMX just like the kind of HTML++.
right.
I think
Yeah.
I think it's a right label. So
Right.
Intercooler was based on jQuery, while
Right.
HTMX is entirely dependency free. Am I
Correct.
right?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay.
And I think HTMX is a little cleaned up. Intercooler, I was still exploring the idea, and so it's got some it's just kind of a kitchen sink approach, whereas HTMX is really focused in on just being HTML++, basically.
Perfect. So I see that you are a teacher too. You are a
Yep.
professor in
Yep.
Montana. We have other things in common besides HTMX because I'm a web development teacher too.
Okay.
And I know
Cool.
the difficulties of this kind of work.
Yeah.
And we can say that you, like me, are a kind of an old school web developer. of course, a really experienced web developer. And we can reach the second point that is one of the most important point of our topic, the origin of the HTMX. So what is HTMX? What inspired its creation? And what problem does it aim to solve?
Right. Well, I think so. The original motivation for Intercooler, the predecessor to HTMX, was I was working on a web application for a friend, and I was trying to sort a table,
Yeah,
and I was doing it in JavaScript,
yeah.
and this was in like 2011 or 2010, so long, long time ago.
Vanilla
And
JavaScript,
yeah, actually, I was using jQuery at the
jQuery,
time.
okay.
And which I love. jQuery is a great library. Excuse me. And so, but it was just too slow. The table that and this was back when JavaScript runtimes were very bad, like they weren't optimized like they are today. And so I was trying to sort this table, and it just would hang the browser, and I was using all the correct tricks and all that stuff. And so I just almost out of desperation, I found out there was a method. I think it's called get. It's not get. There's a method in jQuery where you can just issue a get request and then put the result into an element.
I think
It's a
it was
very
the load method.
What's that?
The load method.
Load, exactly, load. And so I used load. I was
Yeah.
like, okay, I'm gonna try and sort it on the server. And so I sorted it on the server and used the load method, and it just was like instant. And so I was like, oh, this is great. And so I took that load method and kind of built up more and more. And then I wanted to do, beyond gets, I wanted to do other things. And so I started using the Ajax support in jQuery. And I kind of built out this function. And then I saw Angular JS, the original Angular, and how they were using attributes to drive behavior. And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of what I like. I want to do that. I don't want to write jQuery over here. I want to put the attributes on the elements themselves. And so I combined those two together for sort of an internal tool, and that eventually that turned into Intercooler. I open sourced it, and so that was the origin story. As I was basically trying to sort a table, so
Okay.
very practical. And then over time, when I had released Intercooler, people started coming to me and saying, hey, this is cool because this is a RESTful approach to web development. And I didn't really understand REST at the time. I just built a tool that was useful to me. But I came to recognize, oh, okay, so this is like, I'd always felt more sort of like webby, like this is more webby than like at the time Angular was the big thing, because React hadn't taken over yet. And so it felt more web development like to me than doing Angular stuff. And it was certainly to me anyways, it seemed much less complicated. And so I think that was, and I stuck with it, and I kept pushing it, and I kept really not finding for the type of work that I was doing, finding spots where it fell down because the apps that I worked on just weren't super complicated from a UI perspective. They might have complicated logic on the server side, but on the client, the client interactivity needs of these apps wasn't gigantic. And so it just kept sort of meeting my needs, and because of that, and I felt it kept the code base a lot simpler. And so I think that's really like I just got super passionate about it and started blogging about it. And then, like I said, when COVID hit, I felt like JavaScript had come far enough that the jQuery dependency was probably no longer necessary. And so as an experiment, I tried pulling it out, and I renamed it to HTMX because Intercooler.js sort of had some baggage associated with it. And so that's how it came to
HTMX
be.
is a quite a bit, it's a quite a very cool term.
Yeah,
When I,
it is. It's a cool name, and just to show, like, people are like, "Oh, that was so smart." I actually tried to
yeah,
call it a
it's
different name.
when the fact is when I first hear about HTMX, I too believed that it was a new specification because
Yeah, it sounds super official,
yeah, because we already had JSX.
right? Yeah, I
So
know.
I'm
It,
guilty because I thought that HTMX was like a standard, a new
right.
standard.
Yeah,
But
it's funny. I
for
didn't.
me, I was wrong.
Yeah. I originally called it cutty,
Oh,
and the that turns out in Dutch to be a bad like a bad slang word, and so I had HTMX as well, and it was kind of like a second choice. Like I was like, I don't know, but then I was just like, okay, I'll use HTMX instead. So it's not because I'm smart. It's just because I'm very lucky. So, but HTMX on in retrospect is obviously like a
yeah,
way
yeah.
better name. So.
Yeah, I remember when I saw on YouTube videos tutorial about HTMX versus React. I thought, oh, there is a new specification, there is a new standard on the line,
Yeah.
and I then realized that HTMX is a JavaScript library, and I saw that it's a JavaScript library that aims to, we can say, remove JavaScript or drastically reduce the amount of JavaScript that we use in our web pages. Am I right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to. That's a good way. I don't want to say eliminate. I just did actually a speed or a talk that just went up recently as a one that I gave at JS Nation about how HTMX is pro JavaScript, and so I don't want to present HTMX as being anti JavaScript because I think it does reduce the amount of
Yeah.
JavaScript you need to write for sure, but it also boosts the value of the JavaScript that you write and makes Java. It allows JavaScript to be an enhancement of a web application rather than the crux of an application. And I think that actually lets JavaScript shine in many ways. But it takes JavaScript out of sort of the synchronizing with the server job. Like it removes that job from JavaScript and lets it's the standard. It's there, so it's the best language for that.
So that's what you meant with the HTML++ term, I guess,
Yeah,
of
right.
course. And yeah, I see that HTMX quite a bit enhances the standard HTML and JavaScript too, because if we want to make, for example, an Ajax request within JavaScript alone, we have to write a lot of code, in my vision, because we can, of course, we can use actions, but we also can use the standard fetch requests. And with HTMX, we just write one directive, one HTML attribute, and we get it done. So
Yeah.
this is one of the things I like the most about HTMX. The simplicity, the return at the origins, as I like to say, because at the origins, web development was quite enjoyable. I am not saying that today is not enjoyable anymore, but as I said on before, I find that it's a little bit too complex many times. So, for example, of course, we are using React and Angular and other frameworks to produce web applications. But as I say to you on before, we switched many projects to HTMX because we get it done in so much more less time, and so we spend less money, and it's an important topic when you got a software group. And so you mentioned jQuery. As I told you, I work with John Raisig, the first head of jQuery. I really liked the approach of jQuery, and I like that the evolution of the intercooler JS HTMX has become free of jQuery because I think that in the modern web development, jQuery is kind of a little bit too imperative, and HTMX is not. HTMX is entirely declarative in its own way.
Yeah.
So
One
yeah,
one big distinction between jQuery, which is a great library, and
yeah,
I don't want to, but one big distinction is that with HTMX you put the attributes that drive behavior on the elements
Yeah.
in Java, like in the HTML.
Yeah.
And so when you look at a button or whatever, you can see what it's doing. You can, because the HTMX attributes are right there, and that's in contrast with the jQuery approach, which is, this was the sort of standard at the time. You've got a JavaScript file somewhere else, and it looks up elements and hooks in behavior, via CSS selectors. And so I think that's one big advantage of HTMX over something like the jQuery style approach, where the code lives elsewhere, is that when you look at a button, you can see what's going on. And I call that locality of behavior, and have an essay up on the HTMX website at HTMX/essays. I call it locality of behavior, that sort of explains that.
Yeah, I will share all the links on below about htmx.org. And yeah, this is a really important point because I really like it. And this is a topic that we have to talk about later when we reach the addressing common concerns
Mhm.
about HTMX, because I've found that some developers saying that this kind of behavior, which I like and I don't agree with them, it's a bit against the separation of concerns principle. So you have JavaScript and HTML into one language.
Yeah,
But of course, when you reach a level, you got, of course, some kind of another kind of problems.
yeah,
Problems, these are not problems, but we can call them issues.
sure.
But like Tailwind, of course, we have less separation of concerns, but it's for a good reason. Because, as you said, we have in one place we can see in one place what we are doing. So we have a
Yeah,
button, we have a link, and we understand immediately what this button and what this link is going to do in our
right.
page. So can we say that HTMX, as I wrote in my topics, does eliminate the over-engineering of single-page applications?
Yeah, I think that's fair for a certain class of web applications. What I think it does is it expands the set of web applications that can be addressed using the hypermedia approach, or using technology very similar to links and forms, just using that same basic idea of, an element issues a request and gets back HTML and puts it in the document somewhere, which is really the crux of HTMX. So I think it expands the class of applications that can be effectively addressed using that basic architecture. So I don't want to say it eliminates, SPA, the need for SPA libraries. There's a class of applications that SPA libraries are still going to be better for. And you can mix and match the two as well. Like, you can use an SPA technology within sort of a hypermedia based application as well. I don't want to be, I don't want to, what do I want to say? I don't want to be too aggressive with the promises around HTMX, but I do think it can, in many cases, simplify web applications quite a bit, if they're amenable to the hypermedia approach, for sure.
Yeah. So there is this term hypermedia.
Mhm.
I'm not sure that our audience is prepared to grasp its
Okay.
meaning. So can you share with us the meaning of hypermedia?
Sure. Yeah. So hypermedia is HTML is a hypermedia format, and what makes a hypermedia format hypermedia is that it has things in it like links and forms, the traditional links and forms, and those things. So, like, let's just take a link for example. So what happens? An HTML document has a link in it, and the browser, which is a hypermedia client, takes the text of that link and renders it, typically underlined, by default underlines it and highlights it in some way, and so that the user can click on it. And then when the user clicks on it, the browser knows, okay, that means issue a GET request to the URL that's specified in the href attribute. And so that anchor tag, that link, has specified a network interaction directly in the document. And so it's really a violation of the separation of concerns you were talking about earlier, because it's mixing interactive information with the display content. Like,
Okay.
your markup has an interaction encoded in it. And so really that's what hypermedia is. It's media that has these interactive elements, which are technically called hypermedia controls in them. And so, HTML has anchor tags and has forms, and those are hypermedia controls that allow a web page or an HTML document to specify here's a network-based user interaction, and show it to the user in some way. And so that's really what hypermedia is. And HTMX takes those ideas and then makes them more general. So that's the HTML++ concept.
So by saying that HTMX is based on hypermedia, is an hypermedia system, you
Yeah.
mean that is mainly focused on HTML attributes and declarations, directives,
Yeah,
instead of imperative code.
exactly. It takes HTML. What HTMX does at a fundamental level is it takes HTML and it expands the notion of hypermedia controls. So rather than only links and forms being able to issue requests and get back more HTML and put it in the document somewhere, now any element can issue a request, and then any event can trigger that request, and then the response content can be placed anywhere in the document. And all those concepts are actually, most of those concepts are already there in HTML, but HTMX really just generalizes it so they're just available for everybody to use.
Yeah, so we may give a look at the htmx.org website because I find that the
How do you
description.
like that? How do you like that marquee at the top?
I read on LinkedIn that many guys had find that this marquee tag quite funny.
Yeah.
I don't know why. It's a bit of. I say that it's a bit of old school.
Yeah,
It's
it's a marquee tag. It's a joke. I need to take it down. So, but yeah, someone dared me. So,
okay. In fact, I see that you describe yourself as a funny guy on X.
yeah.
I didn't see your X yet, but I'm
Oh
going
boy.
to look at it soon. And
I wouldn't recommend people send it to their boss if they want to use HTMX because I tend to be pretty silly.
the fact is, I read your essay, which
Yeah.
was called "Why HTMX Sucks."
Yeah.
At first glance, I was thinking, why, why is that? Why easy writing these kind of things? Then I understood that that this was a kind of joke, and
Right.
I think that you try to summarize the concerns about HTMX on the web.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I always worry that humor doesn't necessarily translate well. Even
Yeah,
in like English speakers, some people are just like, "What is this idiot talking about?"
yeah, yeah,
But that HTMX sucks essay. It is a joke, but those are valid. Like a lot of them are very valid criticisms of HTMX.
yeah.
It's not right for everything, and it's got drawbacks, just like any other approach does. So hopefully, it's funny, and people. It takes a little bit, but then the joke sort of develops, and then they laugh, and
I
so.
understand perfectly. I have one dream to see HTMX expanding in the future to do what Alpine already did.
Ah,
Is that
yeah.
possible?
Boy, that's talk about jumping me. I think HTMX is probably not going to change much. So I think you're going to have to use HTMX and Alpine
Okay.
because, and it's you do have the HX on attributes, which they address the shortcoming of HTML that you can't respond to general events using the on attributes. So we do that, but that's it. I mean, Alpine does quite a bit.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's probably coming. I'm sorry to say.
Okay. Okay. So I have to use HTMX and Alpine.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So by looking at your website, I find it very nice. It feels like the philosophy of HTMX because it's simple.
Yeah.
It goes straight to the point. So
Yep.
we have an introduction. We see the motivation
Yeah.
about HTMX, so we can see that we can use HTMX directly with CDN.
Yep.
And so we told that HTMX is dependency free.
Yep.
Yeah, of course. So the motivations I read, why should only A and form be able to make HTTP requests? Of course. Why? Why should only click and submit events trigger them? Okay. Why should only get and post methods be available? So as Carson said on before, with HTMX we can make not only get and post requests, but put, patch, delete, and so on too. And this is very powerful. And last but not least, why should you only be able to replace the entire screen? So with HTMX, of course, we can replace the body or only a slice of our HTML page. So for example, a button, a div. So we can place the content directly within the, the element, the HTML element or outer. In fact, we have a HX swap
Mm-hmm.
attribute that we can set to inner HTML or outer HTML.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice. So we have a book too. I've
Yep.
purchased it from Amazon,
I
but
appreciate that.
it didn't arrive here
Oh,
yet. So
okay.
I'm hopefully,
Maybe a Christmas present.
yeah, hopefully I get it as a Christmas present because I really want to read it. And in this book, you talk about not only HTMX, but hypermedia system and hypermedia driven applications too.
Yeah.
Perfect. So we can come back to our list of topics. So we have seen the core principle of HTMX. Now we can see the advanced feature. But before this, I want to show you some code snippets, very simple. So, for example, we say that with HTMX we can send HTTP request using not only get method but post, put, patch, delete too. So, can you
Yeah.
describe a little bit what this button element do?
Yeah, this button kind of captures most of the core concepts of HTMX. So the HX post is acting very much like the href attribute on a link, for example, but it's encoding not only the URL slash clicked, so that's a relative URL, but it's also encoding the HTTP action to use. So it's saying, okay, when this button is clicked, like issue a post to this URL. So that's a lot like the href attribute, or maybe a combination of the action and method attributes in a form. And then HX trigger, and this is another generalization that HTMX provides, says, I want you to do this on the click event. So
Okay.
that event could be something else like mouse over or whatever. Any event that's available, in your web page can trigger a request. Now, by default, buttons their default action is click. So this is not strictly necessary, but I like that it shows that you have this option. You can use a different event, and there are modifiers for events. For example, if you want to put a filter and only have the request go on some events, you can. There's syntax for that sort of thing. And then the last two attributes really capture that place. So the big idea with HTMX is a request is made and the response that comes back should be hypermedia. It should be HTML. Let's just say HTML. And that HTML is then going to be placed somewhere in the document. And that somewhere and also somehow are specified by the HX target and HX swap attributes. So HX target tells you where in the DOM you want to place it. So this is saying, I want you to place this content in, or not necessarily in, but based on the thing with the ID parent div. So then that's just a CSS selector. And so that gives you sort of an anchor in the document of, okay, this is the thing that we're going to place content in or around. And then, excuse me, and then the HX swap says exactly how to do it. And so the options there are, maybe you want, in this case, we're saying, I want you to replace the outer HTML. And that's the standard DOM API language for replacing an entire element. So this is going to take any HTML content that comes back and then replace in the DOM the element with the ID parent div. But you could also use inner HTML, in which case the content would be placed inside the element with that ID. Or you could say before end, in which case it would be appended to the children of the element. So it wouldn't replace the insides, it would be placed sort of at the end of that element. You can say after end, which will put it after that element. And then there's before start and after start, which is like similar ideas, but at the start of the element. And so you have all these different options. The technical, the academic term for this is transclusion. And so HTMX provides sort of this general ability to sort of say exactly where the content, the hypermedia content that's come back from the server is placed in the document and exactly how to do it. And so this button really shows like the core features of HTMX. And it's not a bunch. There's not a lot there, particularly if you already know web development. This isn't super complicated, but it's surprising how powerful these few attributes can be just when you're building web applications.
Yeah, because this is quite both powerful and declarative way of making HTTP request.
Yeah.
So to summarize it, HX post will issue an HTTP request of the post type to the clicked endpoint. This request will be triggered by the click event, but we can set mouse over, mouse whatever event. And the target of the response will be the element with the ID parent div.
Yep.
Okay, so we can analyze the second snippet. There is a div in which we have a button and an HX get, so to the click endpoint, and we have an HX indicator with a CSS selector, and here we have an image with this ID. So can you explain what's going on here?
Yeah, so this element has a class HTMX indicator on it, which by default that will hide the element. It'll set its opacity to 0. When HTMX makes a request, if there's an HX indicator specified on the element, it'll show that element. So it'll show that to indicate that a response is occurring. And so this is a way to give people visual feedback because AJAX requests don't show up in the browser bar. And actually normal web requests, it used to be browsers were very good at showing you when a request was ongoing. There was like a spinner or something like that. They've gotten worse at that over time. But with AJAX requests, which is what HTMX is using to make requests, there's no indicator at all. And so this allows you to specify an indicator to indicate that to a user like, hey, something's going on, like don't, click away or whatever.
Yeah. Clear. And so we see here that we use another element as an input, and we have a get endpoint trigger delay. And here, as a value of the HX trigger, we have 3 kind of strings. So we have a KUp event and a delay and a changed.
Yep.
So what's going on? You have to wait if the value of the input is changed to issue a new HTTP request.
Yeah, these are modifiers to the trigger, the HX trigger attribute. And so here, an input, its default, the default event that it will be triggered on is called the change event, not changed, just change without a D. But here we're doing an active search. So as a user types, we want to issue requests and update the search results, which is your users or your listeners probably are familiar with that from like Google, for example. That's the way Google search works now. And so we want to issue requests on KeyUp, or I think there's a change event, or maybe it's an input event, but this one uses KeyUp. So when a user types, basically when the key goes up, we want to issue a request. But obviously, you don't want to do that on every key up because that would that would be very bad for your server's performance if you did that. And so, someone types like 5 letters very quickly, you issue 5 requests, it's a mess. And so the modifier delay colon 500 milliseconds, what that does is it says, okay, I want you to issue a request on key up, but before you do that, wait 500 milliseconds. And if another key up occurs, reset the timer. So basically wait until 500 milliseconds have elapsed after a key up before you issue a request. And that the technical term for that is debouncing. And so this debounces those requests so that if a user's typing really quickly, you don't just issue a boatload of requests. And then finally, the changed modifier says, I only want you to issue a request if the input value has actually changed. And so like an arrow key, for example, would not issue a request in this case. And so those are just modifiers, and this shows how HTMX gives you sort of some additional juice on top of this, some additional functionality on top of this idea of events to make common UI patterns achievable in what is still a pretty declarative, easy to understand if you're just looking at it, for the first time way, or I guess once you know what the modifiers mean. So that's what's going on there.
Okay, fine. So I see it like the active search pattern, just with one HTML element.
Yep.
So for example, we can send the HTTP request to the server, get back, for example, table rows, and
Yep.
put these table rows within this div with these ID search results.
Yep.
And this open up another topic because some people, I saw some people asking me with HTMX, we can only get back HTML type of response, or we can, for example, get or use JSON too, or XML, for example.
Yeah, so HTMX expects HTML.
Okay.
And I think it works best when your backend returns HTML. I think that if you don't return HTML in your backend, you're kind of fighting with HTMX to an extent. However, there is a JSON, what it's called client-side templates extension to HTMX, where if you have an API that returns JSON and you don't have control over that fact, or you can't create an endpoint that doesn't, you can take a JSON response and transform it into HTML before HTMX processes it. So it's possible for HTMX to work with JSON, but I would say it's not advisable unless you really are in a pinch. And I don't think that's a big deal. If you're producing JSON on the server side, there's no reason you can't produce HTML as well. And I actually think there's a strong argument for separating your application API from your general purpose JSON API that's maybe being consumed by third parties or by a mobile app or whatever. There are good reasons to split those two up anyways. And so I think creating an HTML-based application that uses HTMX actually relieves some tension that comes up when you try and fit everything through one JSON API.
Yeah, crystal clear. And in fact, I saw a video in which you say, that there isn't a gap in performance between HTML response and JSON response because JSON object does repeat the properties. So
Yeah.
the gap is really, really little.
Yeah, one of the things that a lot of JSON-oriented sort of SPA developers will say is, "Oh, HTML is so much more expensive," and I don't agree with that. I think just on first principles, first of all, if you're talking about a large page, you're almost certainly talking about tabular data, so tables, right? Because you just can't have a big web page without like a lot of data that is tabular. And so if you're talking about tabular data, JSON repeats the property names for all the properties. And so that's not very efficient, whereas an HTML table doesn't do that. And so the delta between those two from a size perspective is often pretty small, particularly if you use compression on the server, which you probably should be using anyways. But even more importantly, one really important advantage of the HTML-based approach is that with the HTML-based approach, you're typically making one request for your UI because you're sending your UI back. And that's in contrast with what a lot of JSON-based applications do, where they have to make a request and then they have to make more and more requests. And you'll see this in these sort of laggy SPAs where it's like there's a bunch of sort of filler elements up. They've got a bunch of spinners inside of them, or they've got a bunch of, like loading indicators inside of them. And it's making just all sorts of requests because the JSON API isn't as focused on building the UI. Instead, it's trying to be a general purpose data API. And so that can encourage a chatty interaction, which takes a lot more time than a single request. So I think the hypermedia approach encourages this single request. You build your whole UI on the server side and just send it back in one fell swoop. Whereas, a general purpose JSON data API can sometimes encourage a more chatty interaction.
Yeah, I think that maybe using JSON in a system like that is part of the JavaScript everywhere pattern that is constructing the web development in the world today.
Yeah.
And may I ask you, what kind of backend technology do you use? So you tend to separate the technology on the client side from the technology on the backend. So today we
Yeah.
have the React server components, for example, and we use
Right.
JavaScript both on the client and on the server. Do you like this approach? What kind of technology do you like more on backend, for example?
Well, I'm most comfortable with Java just because that's sort of what I grew up programming in. Like when I got out of college, that's what all the jobs in the Bay Area were. So, but HTMX is very back-end agnostic. So you can use any technology on the back end with HTMX as long as it can produce HTML effectively, and every programming language can. There's some system for producing HTML effectively. I also use Python a fair amount because my classes, that's what my students know. I use Python. I programmed in Ruby on Rails for a very long time, and I have a soft spot in my heart for Rails. So I'm not super passionate about any one programming language and server-side framework. So I've used a whole bunch of different things. And that's one thing I like about HTMX is that it doesn't force you to pick something. Because if you're using, React server components, then you're using JavaScript.
Yeah.
There may be other languages that support that same notion, but there's just such a strong pressure towards using JavaScript on the server side. And I don't think that's a bad thing if you want to do it, but I also think you should be able to not use JavaScript if you don't want to.
Yeah.
And so that HTMX is, again, studiously server-side agnostic. So whatever technology you like, then I want HTMX to work effectively for you. And one of the things I enjoy about HTMX is that people that use more obscure, programming languages like Haskell and OCaml and what else? Like there's some people using what's the language? Gosh, I'm blanking on it right now. Like Cold Fusion. I don't know if you've ever heard of Cold Fusion.
Yeah. Good for you.
Just like these old school, sort of technologies that people,
I was
sort of,
saying Rust, but it's not as good.
yeah, people kind of look down their nose at it to an
Yeah,
extent. But I'm like, I don't know. There were good things about it, and so I
but
like that people can use those technologies.
yeah, I especially I saw that Python developers with Django community use HTMX a lot on the client side.
Yeah, yeah,
I understand that. And the fact is that it's not that I don't like the React server component approach too, but as I told you before, I feel like we lost kind of quite a bit of power by using this or that technology. So, for example, I see some developers saying that they see themselves as a React developer or an
right.
Angular developer. I don't like to see myself as a React developer or an Angular developer. And when you use this kind of technology, it's like that you subscribe an invisible contract with the corporation that backs this technology because
Yep.
you have to enter the mindset of that corporation. So you have to use the React APIs that will be changed on and on. So for example, now we got to the 19 version, and Angular has changed a lot in the recent times. And so I like to see myself as a web developer, and when I use things like HTMX and Alpine, I don't feel like I'm an HTMX developer. I find that I use HTMX in order to improve the quality of my work, in order to get better at what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So this
I,
return,
I,
yeah,
Yeah, I hope, in that my book, Hypermedia Systems, the first three chapters of it are really about the traditional web app, like how does web application development work in the old school sense of that term? Because we found that so many younger developers in particular don't have that background that some of us older developers
that's the
have,
problem.
and they just don't know, even how a basic form works, and so I think you're correct that it's unfortunate, and I do think because HTMX sort of goes with the grain of the web, it makes you learn the web technologies better rather than HTMX technologies. Now, it's not to say HTMX doesn't have its idiosyncrasies and so forth, but I do think there's a much stronger focus on sort of the core web ideas with HTMX than other approaches.
Yeah. As I said you on before, I agree, absolutely agree with your point. You use the term younger developers. There are a lot of students of mine that are younger developers, young developers, and it's difficult to make them understand that that's a lot more besides JavaScript. So today
Yeah,
I see a lot of developers worldwide thinking that the React way it's the only way, or the next JS way is the only way, because it's not. And this kind of return to the origins, I like it. I liked it very much because I started in 2006, as I told you before, when no 2005, the year before Italy was winning the World Cup,
right.
so a lifetime ago. And we got simple technologies, but those technologies would be used to get the job done. So, for
Right.
example, today we have the JSON token, but I've made a lot of conferences talking about session handling and JSON handling of data on the backend. Is it right that the JSON approach is better than the session? I'm not sure. Is it right
I don't
that
I don't
the
think so.
React way is better than the old school way? Because I see a lot of developers saying that today we have got more complex tools because our needs has become more complex. Is it so? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish, I think the problem that I see now is that there's very little, you just don't think about, okay, what am I trying to do? Like, am I trying to do something really complicated? Okay, maybe I need a complicated tool, but when the default is to just reach for for a pretty complicated system, just to even spin up a basic web application. I think that indicates we're not on the right track, and we should expand our. It's like there's a reason there's a screwdriver and a hammer. They're different
Yeah.
jobs, and a screwdriver is really bad at nailing things in, and a hammer is really bad at screwing things in. And so like you should know how that works. And HTMX, for all that's good and bad about it, it is sort of much closer to the way that the core web works. And so if I think exploring that is worthwhile, even if you're going to be a React developer, just understanding how the web sort of worked at the start and the underlying technologies and conceptual ideas is going to be useful for you as someone who's trying to work in this platform.
Yeah, I agree. But the fact is that the way of thinking of HTMX is shared among quite a lot of other tools. So, for example, within the PHP environment, you get Liveware.
Yeah.
We got now fast HTML with Python environment, Alpine JS, as we said before. So I see a lot of backend developers saying that they hate the client-side development with JavaScript and putting all the work on the JavaScript is a nightmare for those kind of developers. And tools like HTMX or Fast HTML or Livewire or other tools like that gives them back power. So
Yeah.
they enjoy writing code, backend code, front end too, more than writing React or Next.js applications.
Yeah, I think so. HTMX, the hypermedia approach, like you said, since you're generating a UI on the server side, it makes people more of full stack developers. So rather than owning one half of a problem, like I own the API or I own the front end, you own the whole feature. And I think that's a good thing because I think it's better for you psychologically to not have to depend on, like, I made this thing and I can fix it. And I don't have to negotiate with someone around an API and so forth. Like I can just use the backend technologies that I want to achieve what I want. So I do think a lot of backend developers love HTMX because of that. But I also, and I've said this before, I think some of the best HTMX developers are actually going to be front-end developers who recognize, oh, cool, I can generate, because they know HTML, they know CSS, CSS especially, like making something look nice is hard. CSS is hard. And but if those developers, those front end developers, can learn some SQL on the back end, which I think is much easier to learn than CSS personally, if
Yeah.
they can learn that, then they can become incredibly effective full stack developers because now they can just make the UI they want, and instead of GraphQL and all this junk living between them and the database, like they can just go and do the database and have an optimized query that returns very quickly, and they can achieve some really, really dramatically performant and excellent user experiences as a front end developer moving into the full stack world. So not just today, I have to admit I think it's safe to say most HTMX developers or back end people
Yeah.
who are sort of moving towards the front end. But I think front end people, if they can get past this, okay, it's different and it's a little weird. It feels weird to me. If they can get past that and learn some SQL
Yeah.
in whatever their backend platform is, they can be extremely effective HTMX developers as well. And
Yeah.
so
I
that's my
absolutely,
hope anyways.
I absolutely agree because in my development team we have many front-end developers, and when we switch to HTMX, I see them enjoy web development again, and they are, of course, happier than before. So, of course, I was not saying that HTMX is only for backend developers, but the fact is that there are many front-end developers that don't like or don't feel like they love the React way or the Angular way, and they find that HTMX will cover their needs to develop their web applications. So cool. So we can give a brief look at these final snippets. We have a confirm, inheritance, boosting, and polling. May you
Sure.
give us a brief description of this concept?
Yeah, so HX confirm is another attribute that you can use it's pretty hacky. It just uses the JavaScript confirm function, but it's very cheap and it's already there. And if you have a destructive action, like this is, for example, deleting an account, then you want to make sure that they really want to do that. And so HX confirm will show a confirmation dialog to ensure that they really want to delete their account before you go ahead and do it. Inheritance. So HTMX, many attributes are inheritable. So here we have a confirm that is that's on a parent div, and the two buttons underneath it are going to inherit that confirmation. And so that lets you achieve reuse. So you can, rather than specifying HX confirm twice, You can put it on a parent and only specify it once. So you keep yourself a little more dry, don't repeat yourself.
Yeah.
There is a trade-off there. The locality of behavior starts to get worse, especially as if you move that attribute further and further up, further away from those buttons, it can be difficult, and so you have to balance those two. Boosting is sort of a weird feature. It's the HTMX by and large is not very magic. You kind of have to be pretty explicit about what you want to have happen. But the HX boost attribute is the exception to that rule. And if you put an HX boost on an element, then all the links and forms underneath it will automatically use Ajax for doing what they do. So that's a way to very cheaply sort of get some of the performance boosts that you get out of that by not reprocessing the head and everything. And so some people love it, some people hate it. There's core developers on the HTMX team that think we should have done that. I am 50-50 on it. Sometimes I think it's great, and sometimes it does introduce problems that you have to deal with. So, but a lot of people really like it. So, and then finally, the polling example. In the HX trigger, it says every 2 seconds there, for example. And what that is doing is it's saying, okay, I want you to trigger a request every 2 seconds. And that's going to go out and get whatever the HTML is and then swap it in. And so in this case, for example, it'll constantly be polling for new news. And if any new news comes up, then it'll show it. Now, polling is not something that's like super performant for, in like high scale applications. But for basic, for a basic use case, I think it's a good first pass. And then if you end up running into scaling problems, you can start looking at, for example, server sent events, which there's an extension to HTMX for using server sent events that might be more effective for scaling reasons. Below that, so that's one technique for polling. Below that is an example of what's called load polling.
Yeah.
So that does a request, and it issues the request when the element is loaded, but then there's a delay of 1 second. So it's going to wait 1 second and then make the request. And what that does, if you do it this way, then what's nice about that is that you can replace the element, and you can either stop polling by not putting a trigger on it like this, or you can change the trigger time or whatever. And so this is called load polling because you're constantly like loading it's sort of like, just constantly making a new request, and then that new request specifies when to make the next request. So two different approaches to polling, to sort of automatically updating elements on the UI. The first one is good if you sort of have an indefinite, you want to just poll forever. And the second one's good if you've got something that may end at some point.
Yeah. I think it's crystal clear. I think that both are really powerful and very declarative. I like them so much. And we didn't use quite a bit the boosting feature, but we use a lot polling, we use a lot the confirm, we use a lot the swapping. So for example, here, outer HTML, as we said before, will replace this element with the content of the message endpoint. So one element, and we got the job done.
Yep.
So we can go back to our topics, and we find that we have to talk about the advanced feature of HTMX, because as for now we talked about the core feature of HTMX, but HTMX is really powerful. So we can make CSS animation, we can implement modern design patterns like lazy loading, active search, infinite scroll. You also have examples on HTMX.org where you can see, so for example, the active search implementation. So here we can, so for example, say Rama, and we got the user with the name Rama, and for example, I write V, and we got all the rows that has the V key within the term. Maybe in the first name, the last name, or in the email. So this is active search. So HTMX will send the request to the server. The server gives us back what? A list of TR table rows. Am I right? Okay.
Yep.
We
Yeah,
can.
and actually, if you go down and click that show link in the lower left-hand corner, there's sort of a bar, a fixed bar down at the bottom. You see that server request 5? Yeah, if you click on
Okay.
that guy,
Okay.
you
Okay.
can see the responses to those
Perfect.
requests.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you can see it's just a bunch of table rows that get swapped in.
So for
So as
example, if I type D, we got a different response here.
yep,
And we see, of course, that we have a list of tier.
yep,
And as we said on before, we get the HTML response. We are not
yep,
using JSON here.
yep,
And
exactly.
we got the infinite scroll demo too. So
Yep,
for example, here, when we reach the end of this table, we issue another HTTP request.
yeah.
We get the infinite scroll.
Yeah. So if you go up and look at that, the way that's achieved,
Yeah,
if you scroll up to the code, you can see the last row in the table has an HX get to get the next page, just like
yeah,
the normal paging concept in web development. And then the trigger is really the crux here. It says
yeah.
this is going to be triggered when this element is revealed. So when it comes into the viewport, and
Okay.
that's how that works. And then it's going to swap it after the end of this current table row. So it's going to place it after this table row. And then that new set of elements, if there are more pages afterwards, is its last row is going to have similar HTML or HTMX attributes on it, where the page is the next page. And so it's very similar to sort of like normal paging on the web,
Yeah,
but we're just taking advantage of this sort of swapping model and this event, this revealed event that HTMX makes available.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so we got tons of demo that our audience can see, can play with. So, for
Yeah,
example, we have the click to edit, and
yeah,
we got here a button. When we click on the button, we can change, for example, the values and
yep.
submit, and we got the new.
Yeah.
The, the,
And
the,
the important thing here is that note that the scroll state didn't change. So you were
yeah,
able to just interact with this web page just in this little chunk without resetting, the traditional web 1.0 approach,
yeah,
which isn't always bad, but one bad thing about it is that if you just wanted to do a little edit like this, suddenly the page would refresh and it feels pretty clunky. Whereas with HTMX, you're able to focus that hypermedia interaction in on just this little area. Now, obviously, the styling isn't great, but I wanted to keep it as simple as possible so
yeah,
people
yeah.
could see what's going
So
on.
in this case, we have to return, of course, the HTMX directive within our HTTP response. So for example, here we have a HX swap directive
Yep.
because the response that we got back to the server will be used here, and we want to use HTMX together with this response.
Yeah, exactly. So this implements this nice little, and I think this is a great pattern. It's really simple, but I
Yeah.
think it's a great little pattern that you can use to avoid that sort of like big page refresh that you get. And if you're using a traditional multi-page application approach.
It's fun because it reminds us that we can do this kind of things without using JavaScript, without using build tools.
Right. Yeah.
It's real fun.
Yeah.
So get back to our topic list. So we can do CSS animations. We can
Yeah.
work with WebSockets and server-sent events. Am I
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, there are plugins for WebSockets and server-sent events that they're more advanced than just the standard attributes. I think they're useful for specialized situations, though. For example, if you're implementing a live news feed for something that's going out to millions of people and you don't want the overhead associated with polling, then maybe server-sent events is a good thing to take a look at. And WebSockets, even more so, is pretty advanced. advanced. So I think the number of areas where that it's absolutely necessary to use these is probably pretty small for the average HTMX user, but it's there and it's available, and I've seen people do some pretty crazy things with them. There's some other, the things that I would call quote unquote advanced, or at least as an HTMX developer, what really can make you more advanced with HTMX is number one, really understanding how events work with the DOM. So how events bubble, the events that HTMX triggers, for example, those can really, if you get into those and get into the muck with them, it's very often that like if you have a problem, HTMX isn't quite doing what you want, then hooking into events can let you achieve what you want to do. Another aspect I would call more advanced is the HTTP headers and response headers.
Yeah.
You can use those very effectively to trigger events, for example, on the client side and so forth. So those are if someone wants to like, okay, I get the basics of HTMX, how do I really get in to be a more advanced HTMX developer? I would look at the events and the HTTP headers, because I think those can really open up some interesting possibilities for you as far as HTMX development goes.
Okay. And so in order to use this advanced feature, we have to install some kind of plugins, and we have to use a little bit of JavaScript.
Yeah, WebSockets and server-side events are extensions. The events, yeah, if you want to hook into the events or trigger events, then yeah, you're going to start writing. If you go to reference, I think reference has the HTMX events. You can see, yeah, the headers and all that stuff. These are just all events that are triggered. So a good example is the before send. If you click on that one, this is an event that's called before an HTMX request is sent. And that request config property on the details object can be used to configure the swapping. So if you click on that configure swapping link down there in the content, oh, I'm sorry, this is swapping. Never, I'm sorry, go back. But if you look in the request config, for example, if you want to modify the parameters that are sent in the request and so forth, there's all sorts of properties in there that you can use to make things behave differently. You can adjust headers and all. Like if you need to, for example, put some sort of JSON token in the header or something like that, then you can use these events. So HTMX is not anti-JavaScript. You use JavaScript for more advanced use cases, but you don't have to for the simple stuff, I think is the way I'd say it.
It's crystal clear. Perfect. So CSS animation, we used it a lot. So I go back to CSS animation, for example.
Go to the docs.
And
CSS transitions.
Okay. And it's really simple to place the animations. So for example, here.
Yeah, click on CSS transitions, just up just a little bit there. Right under the animations.
Okay.
There
Perfect.
It's just this little thing right here. Yeah, so basically the way CSS transitions work in HTMX is if you have the same ID in the old content and the new content, and you change, for example, something like, for example, the class, like here we're changing it from not having any class to having the class red on it. And then you can write a CSS transition rule that we've got down here. This is a really simple one that just transitions the color to red. And what that'll do is HTMX, when it sees, okay, there was a thing with an ID in the old content and has the same ID in the new content, but it's got these new attributes. It'll set things up so that there's a transition from the old content to the new content that allows CSS transitions to occur. And so what this would do is when this new content came in is the text would slowly fade over 1 second. It would slowly ease into red. So rather than just going from black to red, from the default to red, it'll slowly transition. It'll take advantage of that CSS transition. And so the way that works, again, is by having a stable ID. So if you want a CSS transition on something, you just make sure it has the same ID at the start and in the new content and the original content and the new content, and then any class changes or whatever that trigger a CSS transition will be applied.
Nice, nice. We can see some example. For example, this color
Yeah,
swap demo. Okay, so we got
yeah.
this.
So this is polling basically
Yeah,
it's polling an endpoint, and so you can see it's triggering every 1 second, and it's changing the colors of this div. And so this div is starts as color red, and then it turns to blue, and then green and yellow. I think it goes through a few different of them, and because it has the same ID, color demo, you can see down below that dot smooth the smooth class CSS transition
yeah.
rule is applying to it. And you can see the colors are slowly transitioning over 1 second between these various colors. It lets you, because CSS transitions only work when an element is actually modified by JavaScript. That's one bad thing about them, is they never made them work for just like normal HTML requests.
Yeah.
And so HTMX does some kind of it's a little crazy, but it works. Does some work to make that stuff just work with just full requests that come back. So
So here again, we use a declarative approach. We are
yeah,
within HTML. We don't write a line of JavaScript code. So
nope,
it's this that developers love about HTMX
right,
mainly. So for example, here we have a delete me button and a fade out transition
yep,
and hx swap outer HTML swap 1 second and fade me out HTMX
yeah.
swap in class.
Yeah, this takes advantage of a class that HTMX puts on a button before puts
Yeah.
on an element before it's going to swap it for new content. And so it says, okay, I want you to ease out over 1 second. I want you to fade out with opacity 0.
Yeah.
And then the HX swap directive says, okay, when you get new content back, wait for 1 second so it has time to fade out and then
Yeah.
replace it. And so that lets you do this sort of like nice fade out effect. And you can do the same thing. You can fade in. There's an example down below that shows that
The fact is
fading
that
in.
we have to implement that should we implement this with JavaScript, we have to write a lot of line of code. It is not that
Yeah.
easy to do, especially in vanilla JavaScript. So uh,
Yeah. I wrote that code so you don't have to.
yeah, so you see why backend developers love HTMX so much and front-end
Yep.
developers too, like me.
Yep.
So the last one what we can see is this fading on addition. So if I
Hmm.
click this button, we get the fade me in.
Hmm. Yeah, and
So
this is kind of the opposite. This is the opposite side.
yeah,
So the way, again, I don't want to get too much into the weeds with how the HTMX swapping model goes, but it basically gets new content and says, okay, what IDs do I need to work out here to enable CSS transitions? It then will wait as long as the swap delay is, and then swap in the new content. And then the settle period is where it's moving from the old content
yeah,
or the new content with the old class definitions to the new class definitions to allow that CSS transition. And so that's called the settling step. And so that in that step, you can, for example, fade new content in. And so that's what's happening here.
yeah, yeah. So you can make very easily CSS animation,
Mhm.
and this is I feel like this is this opens the door to backend developers to implement some nice effects on their web pages without losing their heads.
Yeah.
And
Well, and also front end developers, like you don't have to
yeah,
write a bunch of code for it. Now you can
of course,
focus, now you can spend your time learning SQL. So you
of
can be a full
course,
stack developer.
of course. So we can find a lot of others example here in
Yeah.
HTMX org examples animations.
Yep.
Okay, so get back. And this is the topic that many developers want to hear about, the
Sure.
concerns of HTMX. So addressing common concerns such as state management, scalability, reusability, and testing.
Sure.
So first of all, I saw a lot of developers saying that HTMX lacks the state management tools. But I guess this is not what HTMX was created for, to handle state.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it is handling state, but it's using hypermedia as the engine of application state, which is the acronym for that is HTMX, and that's the core idea of the web. Is the document the hypermedia is where your state is encoded, rather than having JavaScript state on the client side that is synchronized with the server. And so I don't agree there's no state management. The state, the source of truth is now the server. And so at some level, I think the story with HTMX is better when it comes to state management, because rather than having two places, the server and the client, that are trying to synchronize state with one another in a fairly complicated relationship. Instead, you only have server on the state, and then you have a web page that's displaying a snapshot of that state in hypermedia form, in HTML form. So I think people, HTMX is a different way of writing web applications, and there are advantages to it. And one of those advantages is the fact that state now lives only on the server, or for the most part lives on the server. Active state lives on the server. And so I don't agree that state management is a problem with HTMX. I think it's just, it goes away. There is no client-side state management anyways. That's not without trade-offs, of course, and I try to outline those trade-offs on the essays page. There's an essay called "When to Choose Hypermedia," but I think people there, yeah, it's in there somewhere. When to use hypermedia, the third one down after why hypermedia. And so I try to outline like when it's a good idea and when it's not. But I think the reason to pick HTMX or not pick HTMX for a particular problem is mainly driven by the interactivity that you're trying to achieve, not by something like state. If anything, HTMX has a better state story from a simplicity standpoint, because now you're going from two sources of truth to one source of truth. So I don't know. People. One of the things I think is hard to communicate to developers who have really only ever programmed in a paradigm like React is that there are other ways to do it. And the other ways, like, don't try and fit it into the way you do things. Just, it's a different way of doing things. And that doesn't mean that it's better for everything or worse for everything or whatever. But concepts like client-side state, outside of the DOM, outside of the hypermedia that's been returned to the client, just don't exist with HTMX.
Crystal clear. So the fact is that along with state management, there is the components,
Yeah,
universe.
yeah,
So here again, I heard a lot of developers saying HTMX lacks the component structure.
right.
There is one question that I want to ask you, is that HTMX may be used with or alongside web components, for example, and
Yeah.
you plan to implement some components model within the HTMX hypermedia.
So HTMX works with web components. Web components are I don't think it's a great API. I think the API has been a little, it hasn't worked out the way that it was initially designed to, but they are coming along, and HTMX does try and work with web components like as well as possible. I think, components can be done on the server side as well, and we see that with React Server components. So there's nothing about HTMX that forbids the use of components. But I also think components become a lot less useful when you don't have a lot of client-side state, when you don't have this big, ugly ball of state on the client side. So again, I think that's a little bit of a category error on the part of people who they're just used to one way of building things, and that's fine. What's good about components? Isolation, reuse. Like, I think practically what a lot of people like about components is that they just get nice looking widgets. And that's a separate problem. Like, there are components for web development that don't rely on React. So like lit, for example, is an example. Lit is an example of some nice widgets that work on a web page. And that's just that needs to be separated, in my opinion, from the discussion around HTMX. Now, that being said, a big advantage of React is that there are a huge number of React component libraries that that have nice widgets that have a lot of functionality baked into them. And so I don't want to say that's not important. That can be an important part of a decision around a given project. But from at least at a conceptual level, HTMX doesn't do components. Well, yeah, neither do anchor tags. Like that's just it's a separate thing.
Yeah.
And so there are options out there. Maybe those options are good enough for what you're trying to achieve. Maybe they aren't. But again, I think this is an example of where people are taking the way they're used to doing things and applying it to a system that's kind of doesn't need them, doesn't have that. It's just not. It's not a concept. It's not part of the conceptual universe that hypermedia lives in.
Yeah, I can't agree more. The fact is that students keep on asking me, what if I want to reuse some HTMX logic? The answer is you can put this logic within the backend. So,
Yeah.
for example, with Laravel, you can create a blade component, put
Right.
the HTMX logic within that component, and you got an HTMX component. So you can leverage the backend powers to accomplish the
Right.
component thing.
Yeah. Exactly.
The other thing that I see too in your why HTMX sucks articles is the scalability. Uh,
Yeah.
I see people thinking that HTMX won't scale on bigger applications. Are they
Yeah.
right?
No, they're not right at all. Of course not. I mean, hypermedia is the web, and hypermedia scaled fine for, it's a massive distributed hypermedia system. That's
Yeah.
what the web is. So to say hypermedia doesn't scale is ridiculous. HTMX, what do I want to say about it? You can scale it fine. Like you can
Yeah.
serve, it simplifies things in many ways. It reduces state in many ways. That's all good for scalability. It can hurt scalability. If your idea of scalability is that I can add front end developers and back end developers independently of one another, so that split between front end and back end is really important. It can hurt there. I've seen people say, "Oh, HTMX encourages spaghetti code." I don't agree with that necessarily, but I can see how some people really like this very locked down notion of like this is my component and only I touch it, or like if you want to do microservices and all that, like if that's your idea of scalability, then maybe HTMX hurts in some way. But I don't know. I've become less and less sympathetic to people that say this over time because it's just not true. Like hypermedia can scale fine.
Perfect.
Can it scale with the size of a team? I think so, but maybe it depends on the layout of your team. So
Yeah.
GitHub used the hypermedia approach for the first 10 years of its existence, and GitHub probably is a much larger system than anything most of the people complaining about scalability have ever worked on. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it scales fine.
So I'm happy that we touched this topic, and the answer is the HTMX applications will scale even on bigger application, of course, because this is a topic that I see a lot, and lacks of the knowledge or understanding of what hypermedia system are and how interactions between client and server works. So I think that you put on a crystal clear answer on this topic, and
Yeah.
I hope our audience will find this really helpful
Yeah.
in order to to use HTMX
I
even.
think GitHub's the best example. Like, okay, if you have more users than GitHub, then I don't know, maybe. But even so, like GitHub used not HTMX, but they used the HTMX like approach for a long time, and they scaled just fine.
Yeah,
So
the fact is that in 90% of cases, we don't have to create Facebook or Amazon or Google.
yeah,
So, for example, of course, if you have to create Google or Facebook, yeah, you can use Angular or React to
even
maybe,
then,
yeah, to maybe
Google
scale. Yeah.
Google should be using HTMX for their search page, anyways.
Are they
But
using HTMX for some kind of projects?
They might be using it internally, but
Oh,
I don't know. I don't know anyone. I talk with the Chrome guys because I've asked for some features from them, but I don't know if anyone at Google's using
the
HTMX or
fact
not.
is that if Google, that is the creator of Angular, won't use Angular, is a kind of funny thing.
Yeah, it's fine. It's all good. But
Yeah. So the last voice is testing. Is
yeah,
testing HTMX application hard or harder than JSX application or React applications?
I can't have as firm an opinion because I haven't done a bunch of front end testing. I don't know what the technologies are really for front end testing. As far as end to end tests go, there's no reason why an HTMX based application should be any different than a normal JavaScript based application. Like click on a button, wait some amount of time, and then verify that something happened in the UI. Like I'm not an expert in JavaScript application testing since I don't work that way typically. But I feel like client-side testing is doable in HTMX, just like it's doable in JavaScript. You do need a server, so maybe that's a little bit more complicated. But the other thing about HTMX is that it pushes the focus onto the server side. And the server side is actually often more testable than the client side because it's less chaotic, it's not as complicated.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of your logic can end up on the server side where it's more testable. One of the ideas that came out of the Rails world was thin controllers, so thin logic that connects the web request to the backend logic, and then fat models. And so your model layer, your domain layer becomes bigger, and you can test there. So more of your logic ends up there, and then that's very testable. Like you don't even need an HTTP server to test your model code. And so I think HTMX applications can be very testable. If you're one thing, I see a lot of people like if you're looking for an excuse not to use HTMX, there's always going to be one because it's not a perfect system and there are trade-offs that are associated with it. And so I would just try it. You can read the when to use hypermedia essay, and if you have a project that maybe is amenable to it, try it out and see what you think. But we can we can try and convince people on these topics, but also I feel at the end of the day, someone has to just try it out and
Yeah.
see. Um,
Thank you for this very clear response. So we understand that HTMX provides state management. It scale on even on bigger application. It is reusable and it's very testable.
yeah, I
So
think those are all defendable points.
yeah. So of course you can't do everything with HTMX like you can't do everything with any other tools. So this is of course a very real point, but I wanted to clarify this point because these are what, for example, my students asking me, and I see a lot of different developers having some kind of concerns about this kind of topics, but just I said before, maybe this comes from a lack of understanding of or a lack of knowledge of what really HTMX is or how the client and the server really works, for
Yeah.
example, in the modern world. So we reached the last topic, future of HTMX. What are your plans for the future of HTMX? I see that you reached the 2.0 version in January,
Hmm.
maybe.
Yeah.
So what kind of feature do you plan to implement within the...
It's funny. I am actually writing an essay on this. I think the future of HTMX and this is a good and a bad thing at the same time. I think it's going to be very stable. I think HTMX does what it does right now, and I don't think it is going to do much more than that. I know you earlier asked, like, oh, what about some Alpine functionality? And there is a temptation to do that for sure. I feel that temptation. But I also want to keep HTMX pretty tightly focused on the hypermedia aspect. And so I don't really want to take it much further from a feature standpoint. What I would rather do instead is add add more tests around it, fix any corner cases. There are a few corner cases where HTMX doesn't quite behave the way the normal web does, the way normal forms and links do, and so I want to address those. And then I'd also like to sand the code base down. HTMX 1.0 was Internet Explorer compatible, and so because of that, we had to use a lot of older JavaScript functionality, and we couldn't use some newer JavaScript features. And so I'd like to take advantage of the newer features and really try and get the code base size down as small as possible. Not because I think the current size is too big. It's 14K or maybe 16 kilobytes compressed, which is, a round off error for most websites at this point in time. But just in general, I like that idea of like sanding it down and getting it perfectly smooth. But I don't think the API is going to change very much. And that's bad because whenever anyone asks me on these interviews, well, what's the future of HTMX? And I don't have anything super cool to tell them like, oh, we're going to do this or that. But it's good in that if you're building with HTMX, I think you can expect the API to remain very stable. We're going to have a very strong focus on backwards compatibility. I think the core ideas of HTMX are good. The API is pretty good. There may be some mistakes we made and some defaults, but they're all fixable, by configuration if you want to change them. And so I really think HTMX is going to be, I hope, is going to be very stable going forward.
Yeah, crystal clear. Did you expect the success that you gained with HTMX?
No, not at all. Intercooler got a little popular. I mean, I think it was at like 2 or 3,000 stars, which seemed like a lot to me at the time. I got very lucky, a year and a half ago. So not this June, but the June before, the Primeagen and Fireship Dev, who are two very big influencers in the programming world, for whatever reasons, just the vagaries of, fortune, both found out about HTMX and did videos on it. And it really skyrocketed into prominence because of that. I wasn't expecting it. It had been growing pretty well and I was happy with it. But I was not expecting it to grow the way that it has. And so,
The thing
it's
is
cool.
that how many developers are working on HTMX
Mm,
currently?
one and a half.
One and a half. You
Yeah.
and a colleague.
Yeah, me and a couple other guys. I work on it I mean, I don't work on it full time. I work on HyperScript and Idiomorph, a couple of other things. Like I've been working on HyperScript a lot more this last week because I'm trying to get that to a 1.0.
This is
So yeah, it's always been a couple developers, at any given time.
This is a kind of success story because one developer or maybe two developers have reached the levels of, we can say, famousness. I don't know if I can say this term, but
Yeah,
when you see your creation on YouTube videos,
yeah,
coupled by names like React and Angular that are
I know.
backed by Google and Facebook, if this is not a success story, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. It's pretty funny. I think it is pretty funny. I mean, it's good. It's stressful too. Like, oh my gosh, what people say mean things about HTMX now because they've heard of it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, especially front end developers, can often have a very negative reaction to it at first. But it's been a heck of a ride for sure. I'm glad it happened, and we'll see where things go from here, I guess.
The fact is that I was guessing that many developers were working on HTMX, and the idea of a reactive declarative framework like Alpine made by the team of HTMX comes from that idea. So,
Yeah,
for example, maybe in the future you can create HTM epsilon, which is
yeah,
a declarative reactive standalone and dependencies-free JavaScript
yeah.
library that you can use together with HTMX, for
I've,
example.
I wouldn't. I'd be lying if I said I haven't thought about maybe doing a reactive style library just to like try it and do something different.
Yeah.
But I think for now I'm going to focus mainly on HyperScript and get Idiomorph into a good spot. But you never know. Who knows?
Of course it is. Perfect. So, Carson, thank you for being here, having been here with us and talking about this wonderful tool that HTMX is. I hope
Sure.
that our audience now has got a clearer idea of what hypermedia system is, of what HTMX really is. Your contribution has been of an incredible value to me and to my audience. Thank you so much for being here and good luck for the development and the production of the next version of HTMX. And I hope to have you here in our podcast soon.
Yeah, anytime. I'm happy to come back. Always happy to talk about HTMX. I don't know how much new stuff there is going to be to talk about, but I'm always happy to talk about it. So
You will
thank you very much
always
for having.
you will always be welcome in Barcode.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you, Ricardo, and I hope everyone has a great Christmas. And I'll see y'all later.